Can we all just exhale? It's been quite a week. Oh my gosh. But what we're not going to do is resurrect these historical racist ideologies. No, we will not be doing that. So the question is, can we conclude if someone mounts a higher antibody response to a vaccine that their immune system is stronger? And I would argue that that is a dangerously false conclusion. Thank you for joining us today where Black history is every day. We will reflect on the historical racist ideologies that remain prevalent in healthcare and once and for all resolve the issue that the human race is in fact a single race with diverse experiences. Thank you for joining and don't forget to do what? Click subscribe.
You said the following, and I quote, "We should not be giving Black people the same vaccine schedule that's given to whites because their immune system is better than ours."
Oh boy. Hey, you guys, it has been an interesting week, hasn't it? And it's been so interesting that you guys, I had to hop on here because there are some things that we really need to discuss. There's a lot of false beliefs that are sort of resurrecting and causing lots of confusion, dissension, and just absolute chaos. And so I hopped on here to hopefully bring some clarification and to clean up the mess on aisle three. I was really stunned watching the hearings and just listening to some of the things that I even talk about on a regular when it comes to disparities in medicine. And we've worked so hard for decades to combat a lot of false beliefs in medicine. And to hear these false beliefs on Capitol Hill was so disheartening. But even more heartbreaking, you guys, is seeing our own people just completely dive into these beliefs and not realizing the consequences of what these false historical beliefs were meant to do and how they were meant to harm us. And so I wanted to touch on that today. And so hopefully I'll bring some clarity to all of the discussion and all of the confusion that's been happening. So before we get started, I'm just going to be completely transparent with you guys. And I know that there has been lots of conversations taking place. And I will say that part of the issue with these thought processes, these racist ideologies sort of resurging is the fact that it's a reminder and in some ways does confirm some people's fears when it comes to policies and the use of the healthcare system in a genocidal way. And so what I want to touch on today is really hopefully break down where some of these ideologies came from, how long they have been around, and they've been around for a very long time. But people do feel that the healthcare system is in some ways weaponized. Why does it seem like systematically that there are barriers to us correcting this, what seems like very simple issues, addressing social determinants of health, helping women to receive the healthcare that they deserve, funding the healthcare of women so that the birthers of this entire world can be respected in and out of the office. Different areas. So people have pointed out different areas of our life and pointing to the fact that there are systems in place that are meant to harm and in some way to control our population. So when you look at the funneling into the prison system and the efforts to continue to keep that system populated and then to profit off of it corporately, when you look at the children and the barriers made towards children just even being fed and having school lunches, allowing hunger to continue to be an issue when the access to food is a human right. So when you look at all of these points, when you look at the prison system, when you look at the emphasis and the sort of motivation to continue to support the death penalty and looking at the disproportionately high number of Black individuals on death row, making up, I think the last number I saw was 44%. So an overrepresentation of our actual population in the US. When you look at all of these points, our birth, things that increase our death and lower our life expectancy, it's a wonder why people do feel that way, that there's a weaponization of the legal system, weaponization of the healthcare system, weaponization of law and order to, in some way, control our population and control our very existence and survival. And a lot of these things are not new. They are unfortunately the foundation of the very government that we talk about, of the very culture and history in the United States. So, one of the things that I wanted to go back to is there's tons and tons of research out there and access to what has historically happened in the US. And I encourage everyone to definitely make sure that you have access to information because information is disappearing literally as we speak. And it's important to continue to share these facts, these historical key points, so that even when access to books and access to when our internet is no longer open access, that we still continue our oral tradition, which requires us to be informed in the first place. So this is probably a good time to stock up your personal inventory with books, and make a commitment to read those books, to be informed, so that you can be a voice of reason and a voice of facts as opposed to a voice of opinion, and be able to share those facts with others. So that's what I'm hoping to do today. So let's go back to the very basic. And the very basic foundational truth is that race is a social construct.
People ask me all the time, why do I think Finding Your Roots is so popular?
Yeah.
And I think it's because we have two subliminal messages in each episode.
Yeah.
One, the thing that made America great is that we are a nation of immigrants.
Yeah.
We are all immigrants, whether we want it to be or not. And the other, of course, is that at the level of the genome, despite our apparent physical differences, we are 99.99% the same. And there are forces in this society today that are trying to divide us, and we have to stand up and fight against them.
That's right. And Dr. Gates, real quickly.
There has never been any biological relevance to race. In fact, one of the questions that's often asked is, why does Black health seem to have a different outcome than other communities? Why does the Hispanic health seem to be very different? And the answer to that is not the biology. The answer to that is the very experience. So the experience of being Black in America has an impact on health outcomes. It is not our biologics, because if you take us and put us in another country, our health outcomes are quite different. This has been proven multiple times when you look at US-born Blacks versus foreign-born Blacks and look at health outcomes even within the United States. And you will see that the health outcomes are actually quite diverse. There are lower rates of cardiovascular and metabolic diseases among foreign-born Blacks compared to US-born Blacks, pointing to the very consistent conclusion that being Black is not a biological issue when it comes to US outcomes. Being Black is an experience issue that results in the adverse outcomes that we see in a variety of specialties. There have been some interesting theories about this Black skin that we have, this beautiful melanated skin that we have. And as early as the 18th century, you have the father of American psychology, whose name I will not be acknowledging today, who believed that this Black skin was the result of mild leprosy. Thankfully, eventually, the American Psychiatric Association in 2015 removed his image from their logo. But these theories never completely died. And in fact, his apprentice, whose name I will also not be mentioning, came up with a term called drapetomania, you guys. They attempted to establish a scientific term to describe the fact that those who were enslaved tried to escape. calling it a mental illness. Yeah, that's right. Drapetomania described a so-called mental illness to describe why the enslaved would want to be free. And they went so far as to extend this quote unquote mental illness or craziness, is how they described it, to women, trying to explain the theory behind why some women wouldn't want to be married. Yeah, that's right. They thought it was something that was a mental illness, you guys. Even though these terms and ideologies have been documented as early as the 1800s, unfortunately, they're still very much with us to this day. In fact, there was an interesting study that looked at the responses of white residents and medical students and looked at their beliefs about Black patients compared to white patients. And the conclusion of the study showed that there were still prevalent false beliefs when it comes to, for example, pain and the sensitivity of our bodies to pain compared to white patients, which then has some very evident outcomes. And the result of that was that the management of pain differed by those who had these false beliefs when they treated white patients versus Black patients. So the consequences are still very, very real. But that's not it, you guys. The false beliefs are vast. And I bet you if you pay attention to some of the false beliefs I'm sharing today, you will start to see the footprint of them throughout the healthcare system. Certain policies, certain management of diseases will start to make a lot more sense when you look at some of these beliefs. It was, I'm going to say was, but you guys know very much that some of these beliefs are still here today. And so there was a belief that Black people had thicker skin, that we had less sensitivity to our nerve endings, which then led to the belief that we have a lower sensitivity to pain, that we don't feel pain as much, physically speaking. And that has been shown in multiple studies, in multiple specialties in medicine, from the oncology specialty to pediatrics, in which Black kids are treated when it comes to pain medication compared to white kids.
I need you to see this. Elon Musk is spreading a very specific kind of racism on the internet right now.
Elon started retweeting some of the most prominent race scientists, and there was like nothing. No one. Chuck Schumer met with him after that. He is like the sort of patient zero for a lot of stuff right now.
Elon seems to really like this account. They've gone by a few names on the platform, but they share extremely racist content that argues that Black people are innately intellectually inferior beings. We actually settled this debate generations ago, but Elon Musk is helping to bring it back.
Meet Louis Agassiz, a Swiss-born American biologist who believed that the races developed separately and were of different origins. In his view, Negroes were of the, quote, lowest grade of humanity.
Look at this graph. It shows the follower growth of this account over time. And many of those peaks that you're seeing are the moments when Elon Musk engaged with them over the last few years. A simple response from Elon gives a fringe account like this one access to millions of users, drawing greater attention to these destructive ideas and earning this account tens of thousands of new followers. This page is part of a larger network of race science advocates on Twitter, people who use out of context IQ data and cherry-picked examples to make gross, sweeping statements about entire groups of people. And Elon Musk gobbles it up, pulling his audience of tens of millions of followers down the rabbit hole with him. And I'm not the only one who recognizes Elon's impact. They know that he's the best thing to happen to their racist ideas too, saying that he's done more to raise awareness for their cause than anything else.
People are not being convinced by the strength of the empirical argument. They're being convinced by the appearance of the empirical argument.
That's Will Stansel. He's an attorney and he's been fighting against this army of bigots for months.
People are almost more susceptible to simpler, charts with like race and IQ than they are to the really complicated stuff. The simple stuff, they can look at the chart and there's a line, there's a line that says Black Americans and says IQ 70, white Americans IQ 101, and people go, well, that's it then. This is the most basic statistical error in the book. is the correlation doesn't equal causation.
Now, if you encounter this content in the wild, there are graphs and academic sounding language saying that IQ data proves that people of European descent are intellectually and genetically superior, you may know that it's wrong, but you may not have the language for it. So I reached out to Dr. Sasha Gusev.
My name is Sasha Gusev. I am an associate professor at the Harvard Medical School. I am a statistical geneticist by training.
I asked him if there was any scientific legitimacy to the claims that these people were making.
So I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. One is this concept of race fundamentally doesn't have a basis in biology. So, as I mentioned, like the model, the evolutionary model that we have of genetic diversity is completely different from this sort of social model that we have of distinct, isolated racial groups. And so whenever we start talking about racial differences, that is already a flawed view of looking at genetic variation, which just does not follow those kinds of hard and separate racial distinctions.
I think Dr. Gusev captured perfectly why Elon's role in spreading these ideas is just so uniquely dangerous.
There's a kind of fusion of old school, just like gutter racism that everybody can kind of recognize, and this new school Silicon Valley data-driven analysis. And I think that is very confusing to people. And a lot of times they don't know what to do with it. They say, hey, there's this thing that I understand is ugly, and then there's somebody posting 100 charts that seem to support it.
Talk to me. Why are you engaging in this online? I mean, you're a busy scholarly individual. You're a professor. What brings you to Twitter to argue with derps online?
That's a good question. I asked that question myself a lot too. I think it is important for the people who actually run those studies and understand where those charts are coming from and how their work is being misused, to be out there and talking about it.
There are very proven outcomes, adverse outcomes as a result of these beliefs. And that's not it. There's a belief that we have smaller brains, that we have that we have lower mental capabilities, that we have a natural instinct to labor. There's a belief that we even have inferior lung function and that our blood coagulates quicker. Why would they believe that? Because it helps to justify causing us to bleed. There is a belief that our bones are stronger and we're less likely to be able to take care of ourselves, meaning we have to be under someone else to take care of us. You see where this is going? To believe that we were more fertile, the belief that we age slower, and the consequences of that, and the very false belief that we have heard about this week is not new. That belief dates as far back as the 1800s, and it's the belief that Black people have stronger immune systems. So let's talk about that. It was mentioned in the hearing this past week that Black people have stronger immune systems. And this coming right after we went through the pandemic, where disproportionately Black people died. But yet, this false belief still haunts us. And so let's talk about even where this belief comes from, and then we'll talk about the consequences of continuing these types of dangerous ideologies. This false belief, it was mentioned, came from, and I'm purposely not mentioning the person's name, but this false belief came from someone who is being nominated to be the head of the HHS, the federal agency that is responsible for the healthcare system and human services within the United States. And as a part of his hearing, he was asked a question about his belief that Black people need less antibiotics as a result of a study that he said was done in Poland. You guys, the study wasn't done in Poland, it was done by Dr. Poland. So let's talk about a little bit of what Dr. Poland found. So they looked at the response to the rubella vaccine. And if you're wondering, rubella, that sounds familiar. Well, if you've had the MMR vaccine, you have been vaccinated. The R stands for rubella. You have been vaccinated against rubella. So this is, as you know, is a childhood vaccine. It's a childhood illness primarily. And it is one of the standard vaccines that's administered not just in the United States, but around the entire world. And subsequent to that, we have been able to successfully control outbreaks as a result of rubella. So this particular study was conducted in 2014. They utilized two populations. One was Minnesota, and the other, Rochester, Minnesota specifically, and the other was San Diego. And they compared the response over time, not serially. They just did one period in time, and sort of evaluated the response to receiving the rubella vaccine. And the average time period for people's enrollment, I think for Minnesota was 6 years, and for San Diego was 3 years after receiving the vaccine. And so they looked at the response or the production of the neutralizing antibodies to the vaccine. And they included different populations. So interestingly, I think it was the Minnesota group was separated into Caucasians, African Americans, including with what they reference as African Americans admixed, as well as Somalians. And in the Minnesota group, they actually documented that they had zero Hispanics, whereas the population from San Diego had a lot of a mixture. The population in Minnesota of note was a much younger population and included healthy children and went up, I think, to an average age of the early 20s, whereas the population that was included in the study from San Diego included groups of or age groups that extended from the adolescents to mid-adult age, and averaging, I think, from 11 to 40 years. And so, of note, what's really important is that we cannot take this information automatically and extrapolate on the older population. And so, regardless of what the conclusion was in this study, automatically knowing who was involved in this group and who was tested as a part of the study, it limits our ability to extrapolate this data and say that we can draw the same conclusions from a study that did not include the most of the middle age and also the advanced age population in the study. So take nothing from this if you're in those groups. However, so they concluded that there was a higher response to the vaccine in the Somalians, and then secondary to that, the African Americans, and then the Caucasians. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, they concluded from the San Diego group that the response to the vaccines were higher in the African Americans than in the Hispanics or the Caucasian groups. And so you may ask yourself, well, can we draw the conclusion that African Americans have stronger immune systems? So we have one single study that looked at the response of people of two specific populations that one would argue is not completely representative. Even in the Minnesota group, the representation of the African Americans were about 5.9%, so less than 6%, which is an underrepresentation compared to the US population, even at that time. So that's one limitation of the study. I've already mentioned the prior limitation is the age. So taking this information and applying it to individuals who are older. The second limitation is the fact that there was underrepresentation in the study, at least for the Minnesota group. The San Diego group had a much better representation when it comes to minoritized groups. However, their overall sample size was small. It was a little bit over 1,000 people. So the question is, can we conclude if someone mounts a higher antibody response to a vaccine that their immune system is stronger? And I would argue that that is a dangerously false conclusion. And I will explain why. One, the study documented that the vaccine that was studied was a modified vaccine than the one that was provided through the CDC. And it's unclear to me exactly what changed in that modification. My second concern is the fact that the biological science does not always translate into the life science, the practical aspect of it. My next concern is the conclusion that the immune system is stronger simply because the response of the vaccine was a more pronounced response. The question is, does this translate into survival or infection? And there's no information with this particular study with regards to that. How long does the response or the stronger response last? Was this evaluated over an extended period of time? And I did not find that when looking at this study. Then you have to look at the fact that African Americans are unfortunately affected by several comorbidities. So while you may mount a higher response to a particular vaccine, it doesn't necessarily translate to the fact that you are less likely to be infected by that particular virus, that by that particular infection. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're less likely to have severe infections from the targeted disease. And it certainly doesn't translate into survival. And what ultimately the goal of immunizations is not just a biochemical response, but we also want to see that that translates into actual survival of the population. And so, given the fact that African Americans are more likely to have comorbid conditions that compromise the immune system, the question remains whether or not we would see survival rates that are comparable to the Caucasian population, even though biochemically the response was higher. Then we have to ask the question, does a biochemical response to a particular modified, by the way, vaccine translate into a similar response with other infections? As I mentioned, our experiences is what dictates our response and our health outcomes. So, what if there is something in our history, in terms of our experience and exposure, that led to this particular outcome specific to this particular infection, rubella? It doesn't automatically mean that we can generalize the conclusions from this one study to other infections like HIV, as we know that HIV has disproportionately affected our population. So, if our immune systems were stronger, a a virus that intentionally affects the immune system should have a weaker impact on our population, right? But clearly, that has not been the actual results. One of the other things that you must ask yourself when it comes to looking at a study is, who is the investigator? This study was done through the Mayo Clinic, which is a very reputable institution. But then let's look at the primary investigator, right? At the investigator that was mentioned. So, who is Dr. Poland? So Dr. Poland is the chair of the so Dr. Poland is the chair of a safety evaluation committee for non-rubella vaccine trials being conducted by Merck Research Laboratories. That's a big drug company. Dr. Poland offers consultative advice on vaccine development to Merck and Company, CSL Biotherapies, and a number of other drug companies. Dr. Poland holds two patents with his partner, holds it two patents related to vaccinia peptide research. So this is clearly his field. It sounds like he is respected as an expert in the field. To say that there aren't any conflicts of interest would be negligent. And so when you are looking at a study, one of the primary things I do is I look at who the investigators are. Because sometimes if, for example, you have a study that says drug A is highly effective in reducing a certain type of cancer, but then you look at the funding for the study or the primary investigators of the study, and the primary investigators are that same drug company that can potentially benefit from the sales of the medication, then you would be more concerned as to whether or not their investigation was in some way biased, and it would cause you to scrutinize that research more. So, as we've mentioned on this platform, it's really important to not just run with the headlines of a study, run with the conclusion of a study, which a lot of people do, but to actually dive into the study. That's why some of us have had to take advanced courses to help us to be able to do that hard work, to look at the study design, to look at the sample size, to look at the investigators, to look at the conclusion that's drawn, to look at the limitations of the study, to determine whether or not the conclusions that's drawn or what the primary investigators are claiming is actually scientifically valid. And then the second job that we do is we look at that study, who was in that study, what was the representation of the study, to then determine whether or not we can take the study findings, even from one of the best well-designed research, may not necessarily be generalizable to the entire public. If I have a study that's predominantly or overrepresentative of a particular race, then it's harder to apply that same study and findings to other race or ethnicities, simply because our experiences are quite different, which then lead to a different response in investigative studies, as many studies are meant to be a starting point, but not necessarily the end point. So some studies are startups that allow you to contemplate more about the topic and to better design additional studies to see whether or not you can prove or disprove the original conclusion. If we ran with this one study and then enacted policies and procedures that resulted in a lower dose of vaccines being given to African Americans or all Blacks, right? Because unfortunately, even though we have diverse outcomes, scientifically we're treated as the same. But if we take this study and we extrapolate from it that Black people require lower doses for all vaccines, then what outcomes should we expect if we're actually wrong? And that's what makes it dangerous. Because think about it. Think about the pandemic. Had we given Black people a lower dose of the vaccine during the pandemic, what would that outcome have been, given the fact that even with the same dose, we were disproportionately having higher mortality cases? So let's imagine that another pandemic comes up and you administer a lower dose of vaccine for Black people. Then what do you expect is going to happen? And the question some people are asking, is that the intended outcome they're looking for? I'm trying to think. I feel like there was one more thing I wanted to mention. Let me go through the brain stacks. Go through the brain stacks. Um, I know what it was. I know what it was. Ooh, thank you, Lord, for reminding me. So the other thing I wanted to remind people of, because sometimes our memories are a little short, no pun intended. But remember that initially with the pandemic, one of the issues that we encountered was the fact that we were not getting the same access to the vaccines in our communities. So we actually fought for that. We fought for our people to be able to have access to the vaccines to begin with, because we were unaliving in massive numbers. And so it's interesting now that we are embracing, some of us, because I see some of us in the comments, embracing this historically racist ideology, that Black people have stronger immune systems, because we don't at all. Or at least that has not been proven. And actually, quite the opposite has been proven when it comes to outbreaks of infections and our outcomes. And mind you, that may be multifactorial. It may be a combination of several things: comorbidities, access, frontline workers, et cetera, et cetera. But it certainly doesn't prove that we have stronger immune systems. And the consequences of us enacting on that false belief can be devastating to our communities. So this is why it's important not to run with these theories, to come to platforms like a Healthy Bump Club, where we explain in depth the historical aspects of where these false beliefs derive from and the potential consequences of them. If you bring it up and you reference an article on your hearing, you better believe we're going to dig and find that article. We're going to review it and we're going to bring it to our community because that's just what we do. So hopefully this helped to bring some enlightenment of historically where some of these ideologies came from and just the hard work that we have been doing. We have been working so hard. We finally got to algorithms. And then y'all took us all the way back to the 1850s. Come on now. We have been working so hard to get rid of these false beliefs that have been harming our community. And here comes folks in 2025 resurrecting the false beliefs of the 1800s. It's a crying shame. Shame on y'all. Shame on those of us who actually fell for the okie doke. Y'all, put two and two together. Okay? All right, that's Dr. T, the hand behind the handle of Healthy Bump Club right here on YouTube and healthybump.club on Instagram. And don't forget, we're also on Fanbase because we support our own. We thank you guys for watching. We hope this has enlightened you, inspired you. We need more researchers. We need more journal review committee members, the whole shebang. We need representation on every stop because this is how we stop the foolishness from happening. And we hope to see you guys when the next episode.
Don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism, are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. But when you take it away, I take your race away. And there you are, all strung out, and all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself? I mean, these are the questions. It's if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
This is Dr. T, just a friendly reminder. Don't forget to comment, like, and share. And go ahead, why not? Click that subscribe button. Help us to get to the next 1,000 subscribers. We thank you guys for supporting.